Okay, we are standing by to hear from Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc live during the show, but right now we're going to get the very latest from here in Ottawa and from Washington. I'm joined by the CBC's Katie Simpson again tonight, and here in the studio, our chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton. It feels like we do this show together almost every day. Rosie, Trump's pause, LeBlanc's pause. Well, what's the latest you're hearing from sources here in Ottawa?
Listen, that this does change things materially for a brief period of time, right? This is not the end of things, but at least they have a temporary reprieve. Now, we should tell people so that we understand that when Donald Trump talks about goods being CUSMA-compliant or USMCA compliant, falling under the free trade agreement, that would mean you would think a vast number of Canadian products would fall under that agreement. It is not necessarily the case. The White House says, as Katie knows, it's 62% fall outside of the agreement. I'm not sure if that's the correct figure, but it is true that there are some Canadian goods that do not fall under the free trade agreement. In order for them to do that, they have to be wholly or largely produced in the three countries that are in the free trade agreement. And they have to apply for rules of origin status. So some companies maybe chose not to do that because it's complex and there's a lot of bureaucracy involved. They would now be able to do that in order to get this reprieve from the 25% tariff.
Right.
That is important. It's substantially different than where we were yesterday, but it is not enough for the Canadian government. As we heard there from Doug Ford, and it's the same position in Ottawa, this is not a negotiation to reduce the tariffs. This is not a negotiation to pause them month after month. This is a negotiation to get rid of them entirely.
Right, because if you don't comply with the free trade agreement we have with the United States, you pay the tariff that is spelled out by under the World Trade Organization standard of most favored nation trading status. That's about 5% as I understand it. So you might be a small company where it's just easier to take the 5% hit than to go through the hoops and hurdles to comply with CUSMA. They will now kind of be forced to get underneath it.
What it might do, when we were discussing this in the newsroom, is it might force some Canadian companies who do seek components or parts of what they make in a different country, China or India or other places, to seek a source within the continent, within North America. That's possible. But it will mean that a lot of companies that weren't filling out that paperwork, to your point, will now do that in order to avoid this massive tariff.
Okay, so the implications of this are very difficult to understand, in the minutes since we've gotten this information. But Katie, we know there's a phone call yesterday between the President and the Prime Minister. We know it got colorful, profane, tense, whatever euphemism you want to have there. I mean, what are some of the behind-the-scenes things you can tell us about what's been going on between Canada and the United States?
There was swearing about Canadian dairy. There were swear words about cheese. Not specifically cheese, but generally that's where it got really heated. So I am told, according to a senior Canadian government source, that there were a couple of real flashpoints in the conversation between Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and U.S. President Donald Trump. It was a 50-minute phone call, and it was sort of to try and get to a place where there can be some sort of negotiations when it comes to dealing with these tariffs. The most heated part of the conversation, I am told, came when Donald Trump expressed his deep concern, his frustration and anger with the protections Canada has on access to the dairy market on Americans, making it harder for Americans to actually sell their products up in Canada. Canada does have some protections in place there. Donald Trump pointed to that as an example of how the United States is not treated fairly by Canada when it comes to trade. And I am told that is where the president used some profanity. I am also told by a senior Canadian government source that the Prime Minister did not return the profanity, but that was one of the flashpoints in that conversation. Another part of the conversation that I'm told was very, very difficult and very, very tense had to do with fentanyl. And that is when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was presenting the information, the statistics that Canada has collected about the amount of fentanyl that has been stopped by U.S. border agents, pointing to American data to sort of make the point, say, listen, already when this started, Canada, the amount of fentanyl crossing the northern border was less than 1%. Now, since Canada's implemented new measures, doing what the United States has asked Canada to do, those numbers have gone down even further. I'm told, according to a senior Canadian government source, that both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance both push back firmly and say, hey, that seizure information, that data, that's not the metric we're looking at. That's not how we're quantifying this. And then I'm told the Prime Minister said, okay, maybe, but what other information is there when it comes to this, when it comes to sort of tracking fentanyl coming from Canada? And so apparently it was quite heated in that moment. I'm told there was no profanity in that moment, but it was quite heated. I'm also told Donald Trump, saying that the conversation ended on a fairly friendly note. The Canadian source agreed that that was sort of the tone at the end, leaving things sort of in the negotiating phase, and now we are where we are today.
Okay, but Katie, just on the fentanyl thing, the executive order speaks to a lack of law enforcement and stopping the flow of the drug into the United States. So you would assume seizures and cross-border trafficking would be the metric they would use. We've heard Howard Lutnick and others, the Commerce Secretary, talk about fentanyl deaths. Now, I don't know how you track if a fentanyl death was caused by Canadian fentanyl, fentanyl from Mexico, fentanyl from Asia. Is it the Canadian government's sense that it's the death rate, which is a public health concern inside the United States based on that conversation, that is now the metric, or is it absolutely unclear at this point, like most things, quite frankly?
The goal posts are constantly changing.
Yeah. Okay.
While the Trump administration legally on paper says this is about fentanyl and illegal immigration, guess what the president has said out loud a number of times, and the vice president himself too. It's about trying to shift business operations to the United States. They want jobs out of Canada, jobs out of Mexico, and they want them in the United States instead. So let's, while the president on paper legally, his advisors get out and say this is a drug war, not a trade war. Guys, this is a trade war. Kinda just so this is a trade war. This is about shift. Like, the president has said it himself. Like, the president keeps saying it himself.
Yeah, and there may be legal challenges on the executive order, so this is why they have to keep mentioning fentanyl, because this will end up in a court somewhere. I'm not sure if that matters, but that's the likely destination for it. So, Rosemary, we have a pause on the Canadian retaliation then. The $30 billion stays in place. That second wave, according to the finance minister, of $125 billion will be delayed until April 2nd. Now, in terms of a concession from Canada, that's about a 6 or 7 day delay, right? Because they announced it on the 4th of March, 21 days of consultation, you get to the 25th of March. So, it's a week and a bit that they've decided to hold off on this. I mean, what are the thoughts on the ability to get a full peace agreement here by those states?
I honestly don't know, but it is encouraging that we at least were able to get to where Mexico got, which is the same thing, this delay of a month. The problem for the Canadian government, and the reason you are not seeing them go any further than where they've gone. We're keeping the $30 billion. We'll keep the other 125 on ice. The reason you're seeing Doug Ford and other premiers not back down is that there are a whole bunch of other dates coming up. The president promised that steel and aluminum was still going to get hit with tariffs next week. He promised that there will be reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd. He said the auto sector is not out of the woods yet, even though they wanted a longer pause. That's it. This is all they're getting. So by no means is this over. And I think that what we're seeing from political leaders in this country today is an attempt to keep the pressure on. Because if Donald Trump made this reversal, it is not just because of a phone call with Justin Trudeau. It is because the markets are tanking. It is because businesses are concerned. It's because he is hearing directly from people who are going to have to lay people off and start paying more for the very things that Donald Trump promised Americans he wouldn't do. So how does Canada do that? I'm not sure. And then how do we do that with a new prime minister sometime next week and possibly in an election campaign as we stare down this next round of tariffs, this next deadline? That's going to be complicated.
It's interesting because we've seen reaction out of the United States, bourbon makers, whiskey makers in Kentucky, Tennessee, saying, because the LCBO, for people who don't understand it, is the biggest bulk buyer of alcohol in the world, and it's a consignment thing, right? So the American liquor that is on those shelves, they don't get paid until it's sold.
That's right.
And it can't get sold now. And you see the distributors saying, this is a disproportionate response to the tariffs. It's like, well, boo-hoo, like you're coming after the auto sector. So the pain, it may look symbolic talking about liquor, but it matters in industries really important in Republican states.
That's right, and it's also why Doug Ford today said, that's nice, but we're still adding a 25% tariff on energy to some of those states along the Ontario border on Monday. This is not, again, this is not a negotiation for another pause. This cannot be a threat that Canada encounters month after month after month.
Right. Okay. So, Katie, just a final question. The stock markets have been in a pretty steady tumble ever since all of this started. The NASDAQ, I believe, closed in correction today, which is when it's down 10% from a previous high. And that is not a situation you want your markets to be in when you're a president in his 6th or 7th week in power. Any sense that any of that is affecting the larger agenda on tariffs beyond pause, 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 pause?
I think the thinking in Washington right now is that Donald Trump truly believes in tariffs. He sees this as good economic policy. He sees it as a way to rebuild American manufacturing and as a way to also, he thinks, generate revenue, even though he admits himself that it's going to cause a little disruption. And little disruption likely means is the likely reference to the cost of everyday living for Americans is going to get more expensive. Also, all of the uncertainty around this is going to make business life for businesses, and people have to make decisions about businesses. Everything just gets so much harder when there is no certainty and there is no stability. And so those are the sort of deep concerns right now. And something that Rosie sort of pointed out just a short time ago is that, it's not going to come down to one conversation. It's the constant pressure. It's the constant pressure tactic that Canada has really been engaging with ever since before Donald Trump was actually elected, led by Kirsten Hillman, the Canadian ambassador down here. Just the constant, what American lawmakers are we talking to? What business leaders are we talking to? And it could be those business leaders, really. Flavio Volpe has been talking about this as well. When the business leaders are complaining to the president, they do have a lot of influence and they do have his ear in some ways. He doesn't want to hear about things being more difficult for them when these companies want to create jobs, these companies want to grow their profit, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And all of this makes it a really difficult situation for anyone to have any stability.
Can I just add one thing that the Prime Minister said today that I thought was astute? And it was the idea that that Donald Trump fundamentally probably doesn't understand a win-win scenario, because his business in real estate is win-lose, and that's how he approaches deals. Whereas in this case, in governing and protecting citizens, it is about win-win. So how can they get him to shift his thinking on that front or convince him that we'll both come out ahead? I don't know, but I thought that was an important distinction that he made at his press conference.
Yeah, job losses, stock market chaos, and strained relationships is not great economic policy between nations, but here we are.
One for Canada, one for Mexico.
Yes, sir.
They've been in the news lately, haven't they? It's just a modification, short term, because I didn't want to hurt the American. It would have hurt the American car companies if I did that.
3 days into the trade war, President Trump has announced a change of heart, sort of. He's pausing his 25% tariffs on most Canadian goods, but just until next month, so the threat remains ever present. And Trump continues to dangle other threats and other dates for other tariffs. This reprieve comes 24 hours after Trump spoke on the phone with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and it was a call that sources say contained profanity on Trump's part.
I can confirm that it was a colorful call, and it was also a very substantive call. The focus we have right now is on reducing the impacts of the tariffs. I can confirm that we will continue to be in a trade war that was launched by the United States for the foreseeable future.
The federal government has announced it won't proceed with the second phase of retaliatory tariffs until April 2nd, but its first phase remains in place, and premiers are still moving ahead with their retaliation.
We're going to put a 25% tariff on the electricity that we send down to Minnesota, Michigan, and New York, and it's unfortunate we have to do that because I really have a great relationship with all three governors. I had an opportunity to talk to my friend Governor Walz yesterday, and it's unfortunate, but there's one person to be blamed for that, and that's President Trump. He's created an absolute mess. He's created chaos right now around North America and actually around the world.
My message for the Prime Minister, for my colleagues across the country, and it's one I'm sure they want to deliver to me too, is stand strong. We are not going to accept these continual threats, this continued uncertainty. We're going to stand up for Canadians. This is unacceptable. And we're going to ensure that the Americans understand how pissed off we are, how unified we are, how committed we are to working as a country to stand up for each other and our own independence on our own 2 feet. And I say We don't let up until the president takes the threat off the table.
Okay, it's time to bring in the power panel to talk about all of the developments today. Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties. Andrew Thompson is a former NDP cabinet minister in Saskatchewan. And here with me is Karleen Verheyen, a former chief of staff to Liberal cabinet ministers. What a day, which I seem to say every day, Andrew, these days. It's week 6, 46 and a half months to go. Andrew, where do you think we are right now in this trade dispute? You're in Washington, D.C. right now, as I understand it. Am I correct? What's going on the other behind enemy lines in this trade war?
Well, I'm down here with a group of manufacturers and folks looking at supply chains on behalf of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. We're meeting with officials and trying to get a sense as to what exactly the Americans are thinking. It's pretty clear they are still trying to read the tea leaves down here, too, as to what exactly President Trump is up to. There seem to be a number of different agendas at work that are not always synced up. Certainly, the tech bros want the tariffs to try to reduce taxation. They want that revenue. We know that there are folks like the Commerce Secretary and others that are wanting to, have another go at USMECA, at CUSMA, to have a go at the free trade agreements to try and level out, gain back pieces that they lost before. And then there are folks like Peter Navarro who are absolutely focused on whatever they can do to address the threats that they are seeing Canada and Mexico being weak on in relations with China. And that's particularly Chinese involvement in the supply chains. So there's a lot of pieces colliding here. I mean, you had some conversation with Dominic LeBlanc about how much the personal animosity between the president and Prime Minister Trudeau plays into it. That certainly seems to be part of it. But it's also, I think, an understanding of two things that have resonated as a result of Canada's response. Americans do see us united, and I think that the White House has realized that the nonsense spewing from the president about the 51st state has worked against American interests on this. It has brought Canadians together in a way that they don't think they fully expected. And the second thing that I think is fairly, becoming fairly evident is that the pain points are there. Now, I don't know that it's what Doug Ford's doing to a bunch of blue states, but certainly the pressure that we're seeing on the automotive manufacturing sector, the manufacturers themselves, the question around agriculture, what the impacts are there, even the minor things like removing bourbon off the shelves that's affecting red state employees, is starting to crack through. So, those pieces are all coming to a reality. But the question is, what's the end game? And I think that's what we're still waiting to see. A lot of people believe that the end game is, in fact, getting Canada back to the table to make concessions on lumber, to make concessions on dairy, to make concessions on aluminum and steel.
It seems pretty clear, Shachi, it's not about fentanyl, really, because, and I asked Andrew Furey about this, and he said he didn't do enough psychiatry in his medical training to understand what the president really wants here. But, he keeps threatening, delaying, re-threatening, re-delaying. And Melanie Joly called this a psychodrama, but here we are with another détente and another chance to mitigate the damage on everyone here.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister called it Thursday, just another day. I thought it was, as lines go, that was a pretty good line. I think it's akin to riding the teacups. I've heard the roller coaster analogy, but this is really like you're spinning and then you're spinning back the other way, and everyone's feeling quite nauseous at this point. But, interestingly, I want to pick up a little bit on what Andrew talked about, because we see that in the data. 4 weeks ago, Americans were almost completely checked out of this issue, maybe a handful had heard about the 51st state thing, but they were not, this wasn't breaking through in terms of the U.S. news cycle or about what they might have been hearing or seeing on social media.
It seems to be now. Yeah.
It is now, to the point where I'm sitting here in Vancouver this afternoon, David, and there is a delegation from the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, 50 people, and they look stricken. And they are talking to me saying, what can we do to stave this off? This is terrible for not just our border communities, which, like Detroit, Windsor, here in Metro Vancouver, there's a bunch of Washington state border communities that are entirely dependent on Canadian shoppers and on the Canadian knock-on economy, that are very, very worried and concerned. And really, so much of this, I think, is going to end up and lie with not what Trudeau says to Trump or not what a delegation says in Washington from Canada, because we've been seeing the repetition of that over and over again. And yes, it's on, it's off, it's on, it's off again. I don't even know where we are today. However, I think the sense that we're getting is that the message to affected Americans has to be, don't call Congress or don't call your congressperson or your senator or your representative and say, back off of Canada. It's actually back off of the American consumer. You talk about electricity, you talk about softwood lumber, you talk about other commodities that we are selling to the United States. In many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, we're price makers on those sales, not price takers. They have to settle for what we set the price at. And if we can actually get our act together in terms of diversifying and selling our commodities on other markets, this does get much more expensive for the American public and the American consumer. And you kind of get the sense now, David, that this isn't a 30-day, this is just going to be 30 days plus 30 days plus 30 days, on again, off again, and that chaos, that drama, that uncertainty. None of that is good for Canadian business, but maybe the one thing that Canadian business can take away from this is starting to plan more diversified sales lines in order to mitigate from this chaos.
But, Tim, this snip, snap, on, off, it's, it is exhausting. It is confusing. It's interesting to watch the U.S. media cycles now that when the Canadian delegations were down talking to Democratic lawmakers, there was some criticism saying, why are you talking to them? You should talk to Republicans. The people on the cable news networks in the U.S. right now are the Democratic lawmakers making the message clear for Canadians and, and then also the consumers coming out. I mean, where do you think things are right now?
Well, let me give you another analogy. It's like ping pong. The ball's here, the ball's there. It keeps going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. What's the purpose of it? Never like the game. No offense to ping pong players, but it's here, there, it's everywhere. But
I think they call it table tennis, Tim. Table tennis.
Oh, well, sorry.
That's the sober version. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I didn't say beer pong. I said ping pong, though I may need the beer to get through it all. But look, David, what's fascinating to me, where I am today, so Shachi's in Vancouver, I'm in St. John's, you were just here, how pervasive this story is everywhere. It's dominating local news because the reason so many Canadians are aggrieved, if Newfoundland is any example, and Labrador is any example of this, it's being talked about in terms about how it affects us. And to Shachi's point, when Americans start to feel that here, there's a palpable anxiety here and in other places that I've not seen since COVID. And people are fatigued and they're worried and they're concerned, but we need to push it back across the border so that they feel it at that human level. And you hear some of that. You hear some of that from relatives and families that are there, that this you can't keep this pace up. It's just not possible to keep up. The man is 78, 79. At some point, one assumes it's going to wither, or his own people are going to say, sir, enough is enough.
Well, sir, yeah, that's how all the stories start. Carleen, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, there is the persistent fight with Canada on tariffs. There's a larger agenda of various comments and policies that are alienating traditional allies. Where do you think things are now that there is this April pause?
Well, I think what's clear is we're certainly not out of the woods. We can maybe pause to take a breath, but I think what the government did that I was happy to see was that they indicated that, well, they will extend that consultation period for an extra week on the second tranche, the bigger tranche of retaliatory tariffs. That what that's really doing is just giving them the opportunity to use this next month as a negotiating period, a time when they will likely seek to apply more of the pressure that seems to have worked here, whether it's lobbying Republicans and Democrats in the states that have influence, whether it's allowing, I think, the economic impacts in the states to continue to take hold in the way that we're seeing. I mean, the markets have not even recovered since Trump announced his decision. In fact, I think they actually went down a little further toward the end of the day today. So I think that was wise. I also think it's what Canadians want to see. The unity that's already been spoken to is really remarkable. And the Prime Minister took a time out of his press conference this morning to be really deliberate about saying that what got Canada to this point so far in the negotiation and in this ongoing trade war that we didn't start with Donald Trump. Yes, it was the work that elected leaders did, but fundamentally it was powered by that sense of unity and patriotism that Canadians have. That's what allowed the political leaders to have the momentum that they did to keep pushing on this way. And that sort of sounds a little bit warm and fuzzy and whatever, but I actually think that he's right. I think that there is something to that. I think Donald Trump underestimated the Canadian people, and I think we got a little bit of our confidence back. We're remembering that we're the 7th largest economy in the world. We're the biggest supplier of raw goods to the U.S. We can mess with these guys if we want to, and we would probably rather not have to, but we're in a place now where we need to, and it's what we're doing, and it's working.
But, you know, Andrew, there is something larger than just our trade fight with the U.S. happening, right? Like, J.D. Vance has, dismissed the military contributions of allies, saying, oh, these countries haven't fought a war in the last 30, 40 years. Trump suggested today NATO wouldn't come to our defense when the only time Article 5 has been invoked was when NATO came to the Americans' defense after 9/11. And I was on NPR last week talking to them about the Canadian reaction here and talked about, being in Newfoundland when all the planes came, after September 11th and everybody went off to fight in the war in Afghanistan, the U.S. defense, and no one sent the Americans a bill, right? And now it's become this big transactional thing, and it seems like the Western world is just turning away from them because they're being pushed away from them.
Well, certainly they're being pushed away. I mean, it was framed up interestingly by an academic today that we were, not exactly an academic, I mean, he was, but he had a lot of business experience and government experience also, who said that one of the things we needed to understand is that the American mentality is based around litigation. The Canadian mentality is based around negotiation. Our great success is how do we kind of get together so we're all moving in the same direction. The Americans are, at least the Republican version of that, is much simpler. It is, did you meet your commitment to NATO? We haven't. Did you meet your commitments under the trade agreements? Mostly. And I think what we've got to start doing is understanding that there is a different of psyche in terms of how that transactionality works within the Americans versus how we see it. And we are going to have to start paying more attention to the dotted I's and the crossed T's in a lot of these things. That transactionality is a big part of what the Americans are wanting to push into the system now because they believe they can control the system that way. I don't know, the piece to me that's still very much up in the air is what impact, if any, Europe going off and revitalizing itself, reorganizing itself, becoming a player again actually does. We haven't seen that since the end of the Second World War. What does happen if we have a united Europe moving in one direction, and what does that mean for the Western world order?
Yeah, and Shachi, here is Canada kind of historically been a hinge between the two. That hinge, I don't know if it's broken, rusted, seized, where it is right now with what's happening with Trump, but this constant provocation, negotiation, and then delay, you can't count on someone who functions that way, right? So Canada needs to figure it out.
Well, and it's the reason why we're seeing Canadian views of the U.S. now at basically an all-time low, or at least in our lifetime low. I don't think it's ever been as low as 24%. The fact that only 15% of Canadians see the United States as a trusted friend, ally, and partner, whereas 52% of Americans actually feel that way about Canada. But going back to your Europe, the European part of that conversation, there's so many different elements of that, and I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but if Europe, with Russia at the doorstep, Russia, which we tend to think of as degraded and on the way down, their economy's gone nowhere, they haven't been able to take Ukraine despite 3 years, but a lot of help from the West on that front, Russia's still pretty powerful. Russia still has nukes. And so, if we are, the collective we, if Canadians are thinking, or Canadian leaders or governments are thinking, well, Europe's going to be there for Canada, if it comes to a trade-off, if it comes to who do they have to deal with in order to protect their own sovereignty and borders and peace and protection, they're still going to try and find a way to work with Trump or at least appease him. And so I think we should be under no illusions that we have some power, we have some leverage here, we do have some muscle that we can apply, we do have new friends to make, and I think we also have to have some pretty gut-checking conversations about, who we are prepared to trade with. I think for a long time, Canada has been in a privileged position of saying, we're not going to talk to country X because they don't share our values.
Right.
We're not going to talk to country Y because they don't share the same standards around rule of law, justice, or human rights. I think that this is now maybe, regrettably, I mean, I would prefer to deal with only countries that think like we do and respect the law like we do. But I think we may be running out of choices fairly quickly, and there may be, we may be having to have some conversations around that. I don't know that Europe's going to be there for us.
Well, look, there's who you talk to, there's who you can rely on, and we'll see.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. is still, the most powerful country on earth, and so you've got to deal with that.